It takes a certain kind of person to live this far off the grid, away from the comforts of civilization, nestled deep within the endless expanse of trees. I guess that makes me a particular breed of strange. It's been 6 years since I first signed up as a forest ranger, and in all that time, I've come to appreciate the silence, the stillness that only a remote forest can offer. The forest I oversee is massive, stretching over thousands of acres, mostly untouched by people. The trails are few and far between, and the ones that do exist are for seasoned hikers, not your casual weekend walkers. The deeper you go, the older the trees get, and the further removed from the rest of the world you feel. Most days, the only company I have are the rustling of leaves, the scurry of animals in the underbrush, and the occasional bird of prey soaring above. I used to like that about the job, the solitude. There's something almost comforting about knowing you're the only human for miles around. But lately, something's changed. Something I can't quite put into words. I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences out here. Unsettling things that I learned to brush off. Inexplicable noises, shadows that move in ways they shouldn't. Tracks left behind by animals that no guidebook could identify. You tell yourself it's just nature being nature, or maybe your mind playing tricks after too many days alone. It's easier that way, but something about this time feels different. Something more than just odd shadows or eerie sounds at night. It's like the forest itself is waking up to something unnatural, and I'm starting to think it's watching me. It was a Wednesday when I first found it, or what was left of it. I was out on my usual patrol, taking a route I hadn't checked in a while, a stretch of forest that rarely saw any visitors. The deeper sections of the woods are like that, untouched and forgotten. No paths, just a sea of trees stretching into forever. The air was damp, carrying that earthy smell of wet leaves and pine needles. I remember feeling a bit uneasy that day, though I couldn't quite place why. The forest was too quiet, as if the usual wildlife had scattered long before I arrived. And then I saw it, lying motionless in the brush. At first glance, I thought it was just a deer, but as I got closer, I realized how wrong that assumption was. The thing lying there wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It was twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The body had the general shape of an animal, sure, but its limbs were too long, the joints all wrong, bent backward like something had broken every bone in its body and tried to rearrange it. Its fur, or what was left of it, was matted, wet, and clung to its deformed flesh. I crouched beside it, my hand instinctively going to my radio, but I hesitated. What could I even report? It didn't look like anything that belonged in these woods. Its face, God, its face, is what unsettled me the most. The eyes were wide open, bulging and glassy, staring up at the treetops as though frozen in shock or terror. The mouth, it was stretched into something that almost looked like a scream, though no sound could ever escape those rigid, cracked lips. It wasn't fully human, but it wasn't fully animal either. A strange chill ran through me, the kind that crawls up your spine and lodges itself deep in your gut. Something primal told me to leave, to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. But my training kicked in, and I forced myself to examine it further. There were no signs of predators, no bite marks, no claw wounds, nothing that suggested it had been hunted or scavenged. And the smell, it was off. Not the typical stench of decay you'd expect from a carcass. It was faint, metallic, almost like blood, but sharper, with a hint of something chemical. I stood up, took a few steps back, and scanned the area. Nothing. Just the wind stirring the leaves. But that feeling, the sense that something wasn't right, it clung to me. I marked the location on my map, deciding I'd report it once I got back to the cabin. After all, it could have just been some sick animal, maybe deformed by disease. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't the case. Whatever it was, it didn't die naturally. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that twisted thing flashed before me, its bulging eyes, the unnatural bend of its limbs. By morning, I convinced myself it was just exhaustion messing with my mind. I'd send a report, let the higher-ups deal with it, and that would be the end of it. But the next day, I found another one. This time, it was deeper into the forest, far off any trail, almost as if it had dragged itself there to die. The creature, or whatever it was, looked disturbingly similar to the first. Same twisted limbs, same warped body. But something about this one felt worse. Its skin was bloated, stretched tight over its bones, as though something inside it had swelled beyond what its body could handle. Its eyes, wide and empty, were looking directly at me when I found it, as if waiting for me to stumble upon it. The stench was stronger, more acrid, like rot mixed with something chemical, and it seemed to cling to the air long after I left. I started noticing more oddities in the forest. Broken branches in odd places, scratches on the bark of trees, too high up to be from any animal I knew of. There was a pattern to it, but I couldn't quite connect the dots. Each time I found one of those bodies, it was in a different spot, further from the last, and they were getting harder to find, like they didn't want to be discovered. The worst part was the decay, or rather, the lack of it. The bodies didn't decompose like they should have. No scavengers, no flies, no natural breakdown. They just lay there, grotesque and untouched, like the forest itself was rejecting them. After the third body, I tried contacting my supervisor. I kept the details vague, just enough to raise concern without sounding like a lunatic. They brushed it off as a local wildlife issue, told me to keep an eye on things, but didn't seem too worried. I could hear the boredom in their voice, like I was just another ranger calling in about a dead deer or bear. If only it were that simple. By the time I found the fourth one, a gnawing sense of dread had settled in. These weren't animals, or at least they weren't anymore. I didn't know what they were or where they came from, but something was wrong with them, something beyond disease or injury. I started feeling watched, constantly. It didn't matter if I was patrolling or sitting in my cabin at night. The weight of unseen eyes was always there, pressing down on me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too fast to focus on, but too deliberate to be imagined. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, grew louder at night, more deliberate, as if something was pacing just outside the edges of the clearing, waiting for me to come out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer to something I didn't want to find. And then the dream started. They weren't normal dreams. They were vivid, almost real. And they always began the same way. Me standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the bodies of those things, each of them staring at me with those glassy eyes. Their mouths would move, whispering in some language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard those whispers in my cabin. And every time I went outside in the morning, I found something, a broken branch, a patch of disturbed earth, tracks, faint, but enough to let me know something had been there, circling. It was watching, waiting. The days blurred together after that, each one heavier with the sense that something was closing in. I kept patrolling, kept searching, though deep down, I was terrified of what I might find next. It felt like every step I took was being watched. Every breath I drew echoed in the stillness around me. The creatures, the ones I'd been finding, had stopped showing up in new locations, but the signs were everywhere. Broken branches, strange tracks, and that same suffocating metallic stench lingering in the air. Then one evening, I saw it. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees. I was making my way back to the cabin after a particularly tense patrol when I heard something, a rustling, different from the usual sounds of the forest. It was slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself through the underbrush. My hand instinctively went to my flashlight, even though the last thing I wanted was to shine it in the direction of that sound. I stood still, barely breathing, listening. The rustling grew louder, closer. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to stay put, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. And then, from the corner of my vision, I saw it. It was one of the creatures, alive, barely. It staggered through the trees, its body slouched and broken, like it was struggling to keep itself upright. The thing's skin hung loose on its bones, its deformed limbs twitching with each step, as though it had forgotten how to walk. Its head jerked from side to side, eyes wide and unblinking, the same glassy look as the dead ones I'd found. Only now, those eyes weren't just staring at the sky. They were searching, frantic, terrified. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. It limped closer, and as it did, I could hear its labored breathing, raspy, wet, like its lungs were filled with fluid. Its mouth hung open, jaw slack, the skin around it stretched and cracked. I could see the faintest flicker of movement beneath its skin, like something was writhing inside it. My stomach churned, and I took an involuntary step back. That's when it stopped. It froze, head slowly turning toward me, those wide, dead eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my body rigid with fear. The thing tilted its head slightly, as though it were trying to understand me, and then, to my horror, it took a step forward. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. But then it spoke. The sound that came from its mouth was barely more than a whisper, ragged and strained but unmistakable. "Help! Me!" I don't know why I didn't run right then. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe some part of me wanted to believe there was still something human in that thing. But as it moved closer, dragging its mangled body toward me, I saw what was really happening. Its skin, loose and shifting, wasn't just hanging off its bones. It was sloughing away. Bits of flesh peeled back, revealing raw, pulsing muscle underneath, writhing with something dark and alive, as if the thing was being eaten from the inside out. Its mouth opened wider, and that same pleading voice came again, gurgling and wet. "Help! Me!" Whatever it was asking for, I knew I couldn't give it. I backed away, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it illuminated the thing's rotting, shifting form. It staggered forward, almost collapsing with each step, but still reaching out, still whispering in that desperate, broken voice. "Please!" I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. Branches whipped across my face as I tore through the forest, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far away from that thing as possible. I could still hear it behind me, its voice growing weaker, fading into the trees. When I finally reached my cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely twist the key. I stood there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sound outside. But there was nothing, just the wind and the distant creak of trees. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its eyes, its skin, its pleading voice echoing in my head. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where it came from. But I knew deep down that it wasn't alone. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me deeper into the forest. It didn't make sense. I should have been running in the opposite direction. But there was a pull, a nagging voice in the back of my mind, telling me I needed to find out where these creatures were coming from. By the third day, the dreams had returned, more vivid than ever. They weren't just nightmares anymore. They felt real, like I was being drawn into some twisted reality just beneath the surface of the world I knew. Each night, the creatures would whisper to me, leading me somewhere darker, a place I hadn't yet seen. I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, my radio, and my knife, I ventured out before dawn, following a route deep into the part of the forest even I had rarely explored. This section was dense, almost unnaturally so. The trees were ancient, towering, and gnarled, their bark blackened and twisted as though burned from within. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. The air was heavy, thick with moisture and something else. Something metallic and unnatural, the same smell that had lingered around the bodies. It took hours of walking before I found it, the clearing. It was a place I'd never come across in all my years as a ranger, a spot hidden so deep in the woods that it almost felt like it wasn't supposed to exist. The trees here were different, their trunks dark and split as though some ancient force had scarred them long ago. The air was still, unnaturally so, not a single leaf rustling in the breeze. And in the middle of that clearing, I saw it, the mound. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was just a heap of twisted forms, a grotesque pile of limbs and bodies, all mangled together in a tangled mess. But as I stepped closer, the horrifying truth sank in. The mound was made of the creatures, dozens of them, maybe more, all in varying states of decay. Some were fresh, like the ones I'd found scattered throughout the forest, their deformed limbs twisted unnaturally. Others were barely recognizable, nothing more than bones and leathery skin. But there was something even worse, A few of them were still moving. They writhed weakly, as if trapped in some eternal suffering, unable to die, unable to live. Their eyes, those same wide, glassy eyes, turned toward me, but they didn't plead this time. They just stared, empty and hollow. I should have run right then, but I couldn't. Something rooted me to the spot, my feet unwilling to move as I stood there, helpless, staring at that mass of grotesque forms. There was a feeling in the air, a pulse, almost like the ground itself was breathing, slow and deliberate, a dark force lurking beneath the earth. And then I heard it, a low rumbling sound, not from the creatures, but from beneath them, like something massive was shifting under the ground. The mound trembled, the bodies rattling as if in response to whatever was stirring below. Instinctively, I took a step back, and as I did, the earth in front of the mound began to split. Slowly, a fissure opened, and from it emerged something ancient. At first, it was just a shape, a massive, pulsating black mass rising from the ground. It wasn't like the creatures, not twisted or broken. It was something far worse. The thing was alive in a way the creatures weren't. Pure, primal, a dark force that seemed to seep into the very soil around it. Its surface shifted and bubbled, like a mass of shadows coiling and uncoiling, reaching out into the air. I couldn't comprehend it. My mind refused to fully process what I was seeing. But one thing was clear. This was the source. This was what was corrupting the forest, creating the creatures. It was ancient, powerful, and hungry. Suddenly I felt it, an overwhelming pressure in my chest, like something was pulling me toward it. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, my legs weakening as if gravity itself was turning against me. My head swam with a low, rhythmic pulse that echoed in my ears, pulling me closer to the mound, closer to the thing. It wanted me. Panic set in. I turned and ran, my legs stumbling beneath me as I tore through the forest, branches clawing at my face and arms. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, as far from that clearing, that thing, as possible. Behind me, I could still hear it, the low rumble of the ground splitting, the faint sound of the creatures' bodies dragging themselves towards something far worse than death. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally stopped, I was miles from the clearing, but the air still felt wrong, heavy with that unnatural pressure. I knew I couldn't go back there. Whatever I had uncovered, it wasn't just a threat to the forest. It was something older, darker, and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. For hours I stumbled through the woods, every shadow a potential threat, every whisper of wind sending shivers down my spine. My mind was racing, the memories of that grotesque mound and the thing beneath it haunting every step. I had to get out of the forest, had to escape before whatever was stirring back there decided it wasn't done with me yet. But the forest had changed. Paths I knew like the back of my hand twisted in on themselves, leading me in circles. The trees, once familiar, now felt alien, their branches gnarled and interlocking, blocking out the last remaining light. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep me inside. I kept walking, pushing forward, even when my instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back. It wasn't until I saw the same fallen tree, the one I'd passed an hour earlier, that I realized I was trapped. The forest was alive in some way, shifting, changing, and it wasn't going to let me leave. That's when I heard it again, the low, rumbling sound from beneath the earth, faint but growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The ground trembled beneath my feet, like something enormous was moving below, inching closer. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes, ripping through my sleeves. But I didn't care. I just had to get away. I crashed through the trees, no longer caring about the direction. I just needed to escape that sound, the sound of something far bigger than me, something ancient waking up. My radio crackled to life suddenly, a garbled voice breaking through the static. "Ranger 319, what's your status?" I stopped dead in my tracks, yanking the radio from my belt. My hand shook as I brought it to my mouth. "This is Ranger 319. I need help. Something's wrong in the forest. Before I could finish, a new sound broke through the static, a deep rasping breath, then another. I froze, my blood running cold. That wasn't from the radio. It was behind me. Slowly I turned, shining my flashlight into the thick undergrowth. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, the usual oppressive stillness of the woods. But then, between two twisted trunks, a pair of eyes caught the light. It was one of them, another creature watching me. But this one was different. It didn't stagger or drag itself toward me like the others. It stood tall, its eyes fixed on mine. There was something intelligent about its gaze, more calculating, more aware. And then, as if it understood what I was thinking, it spoke. "We are all hunted." The voice was low, rasping, like it had scraped its way out of a throat too dry to speak. It didn't move toward me, didn't threaten me. But those words, those 3 words, were worse than anything it could have done. Something else was hunting them. And now it was hunting me. I didn't wait for it to say more. I bolted, adrenaline flooding my veins as I sprinted through the woods. I didn't care where I was going anymore, as long as it was away from that thing. But no matter how fast I ran, the rumbling beneath the earth followed me, growing louder, closer. I knew then I wasn't going to outrun it. In my panic, I almost didn't see the cabin. But there it was, looming in the distance, barely visible through the thickening trees. My safe haven, though it had never felt less safe. I sprinted toward it, the sound of something enormous stirring beneath me growing louder with each step. I threw open the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it as if that flimsy wooden barrier could keep out whatever was chasing me. The cabin was dark, the silence inside almost worse than the noise outside. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, from the woods, came the sound I had been dreading, the creak of something massive, something shifting through the trees. The walls of the cabin trembled as a low, guttural noise echoed outside. My flashlight flickered, the bulb barely holding on as the room dipped into darkness. I held my breath, listening, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. But instead, there was only silence, a long, suffocating silence. Then from outside, that same rasping voice returned. Closer this time, almost at the door. "We are all hunted, and now, so are you." I felt the floorboards beneath me shift, the wood groaning under an unseen weight, and I knew the cabin wouldn't protect me. It never would. Whatever was out there, whatever ancient, grotesque force was now awake, it had marked me. I could feel it, like a sickness creeping beneath my skin. The creature outside wasn't my enemy. It was running too, running from something darker. I don't know how I made it through that night. Maybe it decided to spare me, or maybe it's just waiting for me to make the mistake of going back into the forest. I quit the job the next morning, didn't even pack my things, just left the cabin and drove as far away from that place as I could. I told the higher-ups I was done, that I wasn't going back, but I never explained why. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. But here's the thing. I still dream about it, that thing beneath the forest, the creatures it makes and the ones it hunts. I know it's still out there, waiting in the trees, deep in the woods where no one dares to go. And I know that if you go too deep, you won't come back the same, if you come back at all.